Welcome back to another episode here at WhiteBoard Medicine. We hope everybody is doing well. Today, we're going to be talking about Listeria monocytogenes. This is going to be a comprehensive overview of Listeria. There's been a couple outbreaks recently which prompted this popping in our head as a good topic to cover. We're going to talk about the epidemiology, the transmission incubation period. We're going to be talking about pregnant patients, neonates, the kind of more classical just adult who gets it and how those differ and what the risks are. We're going to talk about diagnosis, management, treatment, prevention, prognosis, all that good stuff. So stick around. As a first matter of business, as always, this is not intended to be medical advice. Please check out the full disclaimer at the end of the episode or in the episode's description. In addition to that, a couple shameless plugs. Per usual, check out our Patreon page. We post study guides, practice questions, pretty much every other day on there. Check out our weekly newsletter. That's more kind of public health, emerging infectious disease focused. Again, we send that out each week, and then we have both podcast platform and Patreon page. All that stuff's linked in the description for the episode. We'd love to hear your thoughts and get you subscribed, involved, and join the WhiteBoard Medicine community. So enough of the shameless plugs. No further ado, let's dive into Listeria monocytogenes. So starting with epidemiology for Listeria. So Listeria incidence is quite rare. Most people will never have a run-in with Listeria in their life, but if you do get it, it can be quite serious. It is most classically a foodborne illness. So Listeria lives in the soil. It lives in water, vegetation, animal feces. These are kind of the reservoirs for Listeria, where it kind of hangs out and grows when it's not making people sick. And as such, you can imagine that it's easy-ish for it to get into food. Our food obviously grows in soil. We water it. There's other vegetation around, and the reality is animal feces too. So that's how it tends to get in food, and then humans tend to get it from eating contaminated food, which is going to play a role in a lot of the stuff we talk about. And that gets into transmission. Transmission is primarily via ingestion of contaminated, unpasteurized dairy, deli meat, hot dogs, soft cheeses, and refrigerated, ready-to-eat foods. These are those classical foods that we see Listeria outbreaks in. So just to say it again, unpasteurized dairy, deli meats and hot dogs, soft cheeses in particular, and refrigerated, ready-to-eat foods. That's why in pregnant patients, a lot of times they're told to stay away from deli meats, stay away from hot dogs, and stay away from soft cheeses, is literally because of Listeria, because it can be really, really serious in pregnant patients, which again is something we'll talk about. It's a nice transition into this idea of vertical transmission. That the mother can give it to their unborn fetus. It can actually travel across the placenta into the unborn fetus. It can also get into the fetus during the delivery process itself. Again, why we are so focused on pregnant patients when it comes to Listeria. The high-risk population is the populations of people that can get super sick are pregnant women, neonates, elderly adults, and then immunocompromised individuals, people that maybe have had organ transplants, or they have cancer and on chemotherapy, or they have HIV or AIDS, or they're on immunosuppressive medications for, let's say, a rheumatologic condition like rheumatoid arthritis or lupus. So these four categories of people, pregnant women, neonates, elderly adults, and immunocompromised patients are kind of four concerning high-risk population that can get really sick from Listeria. We do see Listeria more often in warmer months, although you can see it year-round. So bacteriology, what is Listeria? We've talked about how common it is and who's at risk, but what actually is it? Well, it's a bacteria, and it's called Listeria monocytogenes, although a lot of times we just say Listeria. For those of you interested in bacteriology, this is a gram-positive bacillus. Gram-positive means it stains with a gram stain as purple, and bacillus means it's kind of this ovoid shape when you stain it, rather than cocci, which is circular, spherical. It is facultative intracellular. This means that it actually goes into your cells. So you have your cells, you have a nucleus. Some bacteria stay outside the cell. All right, some bacteria actually go inside the cell. So this is a facultative intracellular organism. It can go inside human cells rather than just hanging out in the body outside of those cells. It does have tumbling motility at room temperature. This is kind of one of those fast facts that sometimes shows up on tests, although isn't probably very clinically relevant. Another one of those fast facts that can show up on tests, it's beta hemolytic on blood agar. These are two just kind of factoids that sometimes show up on exams. And the third factoid is that it's catalase positive. So for clinical exams, you might see this buzz phrase of tumbling motility at room temperature, or you might see something that says beta hemolytic on blood agar and catalase positive, which would imply listeria rather than something else like streptococcus agalactiae, which is also beta hemolytic positive on blood agar, but it's catalase negative. Again, not high yield for the clinical arena, but may see a question on a test somewhere with those factoids. It does grow in cold temperatures, including refrigeration. If you think about some of the foods we're worried about, soft cheeses, deli meat, unfortunately refrigerating these things does not necessarily make it so it cannot grow, which is the case for a number of different bacteria, but not this one. And it's a facultative anaerobe. It means it can live without oxygen. It can, C-A-N, live without oxygen. Pathogenesis, we'll just talk about this quick. It has several different things that make it able to infect, invade, and make humans sick. One of those things is called internalins. These help the bacteria invade the host cell, because we said this is an intracellular bacteria. It gets into the cell, and these internalins can help it do that. It also has this Listeria lysine O, which helps it escape something called the phagosome. The phagosome is part of our defense against bacteria, where we can put the bacteria in this kind of endosome, this circular capture device, and destroy it. But Listeria can break out of that using Listeria lysine O. And then this is a fun name, but it can spread cell to cell using actin rockets, which helps it get from cell to cell. And it shares that property with Shigella. All right, on to some of the more clinically relevant things, clinical manifestations and causes. So we're going to break this down by patient population. We're going to first talk about pregnant women, then neonates, then adults, immunocompromised and elderly, and then healthy adults. So when it comes to pregnant women, it often presents like a flu-like illness. You will get some fever, some myalgias or muscle aches, and then GI symptoms, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain. And in pregnant women, we get so worried, which is why we tell pregnant women to avoid deli meat and soft cheeses, because it really can affect the unborn fetus. It can cause a spontaneous abortion where the fetus dies, stillbirth where the fetus dies before birth, and even preterm delivery. So this is really, really serious. The mom usually ends up okay, but it's the unborn fetus that can get really sick. And it's tough to diagnose, right? Because you get this kind of non-specific generic flu-like illness, right? How many things cause fever, muscle aches, and GI discomfort? A bunch, a ton. But Listeria can be one of those things. And if it is Listeria, it can be really, really serious. In neonates, it usually starts as this kind of sepsis pathogenic within 1 week. But if it's been in the neonate for a more prolonged period of time, it can invade into the brain and cause meningitis. Itis being inflammation, meninges being the covering of the brain. And this can be deadly to neonates. So the big concern is early onset Listeria neonates usually causes sepsis like many infections do. Later onset can cause meningitis. In adults and immunocompromised patients, meningitis is one of the big concerns that adults who are immunocompromised and elderly can get. That's why we'll get into this, but in elderly adults and immunocompromised, when you're empirically covering them for meningitis, you give them ampicillin, which is specifically because they're at risk for getting Listeria meningitis. It may present as this rhomboencephalitis, not super important, but encephalitis and meningitis are overlapping terms, but they are slightly different. And you can get both meningitis and encephalitis at the same time, which may present as rhomboencephalitis. And then healthy adults, adults who are immunocompromised and elderly can just have a sepsis bacteremia picture where a source won't really grow out. But yeah, meningitis and encephalitis is a big concern. And healthy adults really do okay. They're often asymptomatic, meaning they don't have symptoms, or if they have anything, it's kind of this self-limited gastroenteritis, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, belly cramping, but it just gets better. And listeria in healthy adults is honestly not a huge deal. It's really pregnant women, neonates, immunocompromised adults, and elderly adults that can get really sick. Healthy adults, you actually don't really even give ampicillin to if you're worried about meningitis, because listeria is not a cause of meningitis in any significant number of healthy adults. So fortunately or unfortunately, if you're healthy, you tend to do okay with listeria. If you fall into the other three categories, it can be life-threatening. The differential diagnosis, what else do we need to think about in patients who are thinking about listeria? We break this up into two different things. The first is the differential for the meningitis encephalitis, and this you tend to see, right, in those elderly patients, immunocompromised patients, pediatric patients, and all the typical differential for meningitis encephalitis is on here. So, we don't need to dive too deep in all these, but this is the differential for patients with meningitis. It could be strep pneumoniae, it could be Neisseria, it could be Haemophilus, Cryptococcus, Mycobacterium tuberculosis can cause meningitis, although not very common. Viral encephalitides, HSV, West Nile, VZV, all that kind of stuff. So just classical differential diagnosis for meningitis encephalitis. The gastroenteritis that it causes also has kind of that classical differential for infectious gastroenteritis, right? You can have Salmonella, you can have Shigella, Campylobacter, different E. coli's, which we've covered, norovirus, which we've covered. So this is another kind of generic differential for gastroenteritis, which could be listeria. And then for neonatal sepsis and meningitis, which listeria can cause, again, not to keep with the same theme, but kind of that generic differential for neonatal sepsis and meningitis, which can still be strep, E. coli, different viral encephalitides. So the summary statement here is the differential for listeria is best thought about based on the disease the listeria is causing. If it's causing meningitis encephalitis, use your meningitis encephalitis differential. If it's causing gastroenteritis, use that differential. If it's in a neonate, use that differential. And none of the differentials are that unique or complex. Listeria is a less common cause of a lot of these differentials, like gastro and meningitis, encephalitis, all that kind of stuff. How do we risk stratify these patients? We kind of peripherally cover this, but just to explicitly say it out loud, the low-risk patients are healthy, immunocompetent adults, and they typically only get mild GI symptoms, or they are completely asymptomatic. They do totally okay with listeria. The high-risk patients, you could probably hopefully list them in your head, but pregnant patients, especially if they're later on in their pregnancy, like the third trimester, neonates, or anyone immunocompromised or elderly. And those immunocompromised patients might be patients with cancer, on chemotherapy, those on steroids, those on immunosuppressive medications for a transplant or rheumatologic disease, or those with an immunocompromising infectious disease like HIV. 65 years old tends to be one of those kind of bridges we use to say, yes, you're elderly and at risk. So take that for what it's worth. Age is just a number, but yes, we tend to use 65. Anyone with meningitis in any of these high-risk groups should get empiric coverage for listeria, which is with ampicillin, which we talked about. So anyone over the age of 65, anyone immunocompromised, pregnant, neonates who have potentially meningitis encephalitis, they should get empiric treatment with ampicillin, which is a nice transition into the next discussion, which is treatment. Okay, so first-line treatment for listeria. High-dose ampicillin is the drug of choice. You can sometimes combine this with gentamicin. We have not seen this too much, but there's some data to suggest there's synergy there for severe disease. The duration for meningitis is long, at least 3 weeks. If it's in the blood, bacteremia, it can be prolonged 2 to 3 weeks. Pregnancy, 14 days. Neonatal meningitis, 21 days. This all is, I'm going to say like ish. This is not hard and fast. There's some variability here, but it's just some rough kind of contextual durations just to help you visualize it in your brain. Alternatives to ampicillin if there's a penicillin allergy. Bactrim or trimethylprin sulfamethoxazole is a second-line agent. And meropenem is another option. Interestingly enough, there is some resistance risk with meropenem for listeria, so Bactrim is a better option, but you could consider meropenem. And then the other part of treatment is really supportive care. These patients need really good supportive care, organ support, sometimes the ICU if they're in shock. There's always a question on should you give steroids if you think it's Listeria meningitis, and not typically recommended for Listeria meningitis. Really, we reserve that for strep pneumoniae meningitis. So if you think it's Listeria meningitis, there isn't really an indication to give steroids. Prognosis, which is related to risk stratification. As one can imagine, for healthy adults, the prognosis is excellent, right? We said those do well. For pregnant patients, the maternal prognosis is usually excellent as well. Their illness is often very mild, but fetal outcomes can be really poor, right? We talked about stillbirth, we talked about spontaneous abortions, preterm labor. In neonates, there's a really high mortality. The mortality for neonates that get Listeria is about 20 to 30%, even if they have treatment. So 1 in 5 or 1 in 3-ish patients who are neonatal who get Listeria, even with treatment, will die. So really, really, really sick in neonates, young kiddos. Mortality rate in immunocompromised adults is really significant too. For the meningitis, if immunocompromised adults get Listeria meningitis, their mortality is also about 20 to 30%. So really severe. But that's for the meningitis specifically. Early treatment, like many infectious diseases, is absolutely critical to try to improve outcomes. If there's any possibility for Listeria, you really want to empirically treat these patients with that ampicillin to try to improve their outcome best you can. Key points to remember. We're towards the end here now. So think Listeria in pregnant patients with flu-like illness. This is not a fair statement to make because there's a lot of different things that can cause pregnant patients to have flu-like illness. But if they have it, it should be on your differential. Because if you don't put it on your differential, you'll never diagnose it. Okay? Do a little risk stratification, whether they've been eating, what other symptoms might they have. It should be on your differential for neonatal and elderly and immunocompromised patients with meningitis. Ampicillin, ampicillin, ampicillin. So any neonate, any elderly, or any immunocompromised patient with concern for meningitis, you need to empirically treat for Listeria. Cephalosporins don't treat Listeria. You must have ampicillin or one of the alternate agents like we talked about with bacterium. Refrigerated foods are a key source. Deli meats, soft cheeses, educate at-risk patients. Our pregnant patients should really avoid these. Now, it's a rare disease, but if you happen to be one of the people that get it, it doesn't matter how rare it is, it can still make you really sick. And it's an intracellular pathogen, so you have to use antibiotics with good intracellular penetration, hence the antibiotics we talked about with ampicillin and bacterium. All right, hopefully that was interesting, informative, helped people understand some of the outbreaks, helped people protect themselves, and helped us in the clinical arena better understand Listeria. This is a rare disease, but it's one that in the right patient can be really severe, especially with kind of that meningitis archetype that we talked about. So let us know what thoughts, comments, questions you have. Again, we'd love for you to check out our Patreon page, weekly newsletter, YouTube, and podcasts, all linked in the description for this episode. In any case, stay well, keep learning, and we'll certainly see you next time. Hey everybody, and welcome to WhiteBoard Medicine. We appreciate you checking out the video. Here at WhiteBoard Medicine, our goal is to create medical education content for all types of interested learners. That includes videos, practice questions, study resources, and much more. We would love for you to join our community by subscribing, hit that bell button. We're also working to build a high-yield Patreon page. It's going to be full of practice questions, video outlines, notes, commercial-free content, and much more.
None of these videos are intended to be acted upon as medical advice. Please pause the video here and read this disclaimer in its entirety before moving on.